Right. Kia ora koutou. Ko samaho. Thank you. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this really interesting webinar that we've got in store for you today. So today's webinar is jointly brought to you from the Australasian College of Road Safety, the New Zealand chapter specifically, as well as the Auckland and Northland branch of Engineering New Zealand transcript group. So the webinar is scheduled to take about 45 minutes. I think we'll talk for about 30 to 35, and we'll leave some time at the end there for questions. Feel free to please write these questions into the Q&A section of Zoom, or if, for the guys in the room who I've already said, if you can leave these till the end. And I'll try to make sure that I speak out the questions to you in the webinar so you hear them as well at home. Don't forget, please, as well, to leave your cameras off and your microphones off as we're going through. We'll have a recording of this presentation at the end, and we'll hopefully be able to put that through in the usual place through ACRS. Right. So we're excited to bring you this webinar. In this session, we're going to embark on an important journey to explore and address the complexities around suicide in the transport system. So this webinar is going to build on the presentation that Andrew gave at the Australasian Road Safety Conference in 2022, which was extremely well received. And its primary aim is to raise the profile of what is otherwise a very taboo topic. So Andrew will speak of his experience in this topic. Andrew is the Network Safety Manager for Waka Kotahi's Maintenance Alliance, which is responsible for the day-to-day operations of maintenance on the Auckland State highway network. The work that he's done and the team has done has been awarded a national award for road safety from the National Road Safety Trauma Centre. So at the close of this presentation, we hope that you in Australia and New Zealand and whoever's listening out there is also going to become an ambassador for reducing road suicide in the road transport system. Thank you all for joining in this important conversation. I'll now pass on to Andrew. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Sam, for that introduction. And thank you to both of those of you who are online today and also present in the room here, and for taking the time out of your day to listen into this topic. Assuming that you haven't been dragged along to this presentation today, I'll assume that you've signed up to attend and hence are aware that it covers what can be a confronting topic, that of suicide. So I just want to acknowledge and remind you that some of the content may be distressing for some people. I therefore do urge your discretion in your participation. But just to note, I won't be sharing any overly confronting pictures. However, I will share some examples of incidents to help put the issue into perspective. So, should you feel that you require any support as a result of your participation today, I'll draw your attention to some of the New Zealand-based support services available, or ask that you simply reach out to some of your peers for support. As Sam mentioned, the presentation today builds on one that I gave at the Australasian Road Safety Conference back in 2022. It's because of that presentation that I've been asked to present today. While this presentation will cover much of the same content, I'll be able to add some more context and delve a little deeper due to the extra time that's afforded to me today. My intention is to start by providing an overview of some suicide statistics to help put the issues and the magnitude of the challenge into context. I'll then briefly take you on the journey I've been on over the past 25 years. This journey will note our thought processes and what we've been able to achieve to date. It will also note that at present, we're simply at a loss as what we can do to prevent this harm in some cases. But hopefully, some of you might have the answers that we're looking for. And I'll finish with my thoughts on where to next as we strive to make a difference. Unfortunately, as suicide is one of those taboo topics, it's not something that we tend to talk about or even recognise unless we're being directly impacted. Therefore, the primary purpose of this presentation today is to help raise awareness around the issue of suicide on our transport network. This presentation will focus on my experience around the Auckland State highway network and will not cover any other transport modes. But I do note that there are both common themes and unique characteristics between different transport modes and networks. I hope to get you thinking about if there's anything you can do to help make a difference. I believe that with a raised awareness, collectively, we can make a positive difference via the many different roles that we have. Please note, I do not profess to be an expert in the field of suicide. In fact, I'm far from it. What I'm sharing is what I have experienced and what I've learned over the past 2 decades. I suspect that, like myself, for those of you who are engineers, that very few, if any of us, would have received instruction on the topic of suicide as we learned how to design and manage a roading network. After all, suicide is a social issue and not one for engineering to address. Or is it? Typically, as engineers, we love numbers and stats. So let's start with some numbers. According to the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the number 42 is the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But unfortunately, 42 is not the answer here. And I stress that I don't have all the answers for you. But I do hope that going forward, collectively, we may be able to identify some of those elusive answers and make a positive difference in our communities. As a starting point, it's important to note that in New Zealand, the threshold is set high for a death to be ruled as suicide. Suicide is defined as the act of intentionally killing oneself. Whether or not a person intended to kill themselves is determined by the coroner. So, a death is only confirmed as a suicide if there's evidence beyond reasonable doubt that the person who died intended to kill themselves. This means that some deaths suspected to be suicide may be confirmed as a death from another cause after the coroner's inquiry. So this can be a challenging topic to be able to table a definitive set of numbers on. The numbers that I'll use today come from various sources over the past few years. And in referring to them, I'll caution you against getting too caught up in the actual numbers. Rather, I'd prefer that you focus more on the relative magnitude of those numbers and the comparisons I'll give. It's important to note that not all data sets are immediately comparable, especially when we try and benchmark against overseas data. Key issues in comparing data can be that different countries have different reporting periods, that different standards are used to determine whether a death is a suicide or not. As an example, an investigation is not always undertaken, and the level of proof required for a death to be recorded as a suicide is not the same in all countries. And that issues including religion, social class, occupation of a victim, or even the criminal status of suicide in the country may influence whether a death is recorded as a suicide or not. As a result, it can be very difficult to categorically state that the number of suicides is in fact the number X, unlike many of the other engineering data sets that we're more used to using. This chart, based on the World Health Organization 2019 data, indicates roughly where suicide is implied to sit on the international scale for suicide rate per 100,000 head of population. This is New Zealand sitting comparable with Iceland. And as you can see, there's quite a range between South Africa, apparently at the lower end of the scale, to Korea at the upper end. We also note the difference between Australia and New Zealand, two countries that we so often compare one another against in so many other metrics. The World Health Organization notes that suicide remains one of the leading causes of death worldwide. In 2019, more than 700,000 people died by suicide, which equates to roughly 1 in every 100 deaths. They note that every year, more people die as a result of suicide than HIV, malaria, or breast cancer, or war and homicide. The World Health Organization also notes that amongst young people aged 15 to 29, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death after road injury, tuberculosis, and interpersonal violence. And that more than twice as many males die due to suicide as females. And that suicide rates amongst men are generally higher in high-income countries, whilst for females, the highest suicide rates tend to be found in the lower to middle-income countries. But we should also be aware that there are varying trends within our own population, with Māori continuing to be disproportionately negatively affected. The rate of suspected suicide for Māori was 15.9 per 100,000, whilst it was 9.9 for our Pacific populations and only 3.8 per 100,000 for Asian populations by comparison. In New Zealand, from July 2021 through to June 22, 538 deaths were recorded as suspected suicide. Not a number as a country that we should be proud of. But if we were to take a little bit of positive news, we could note that this was the third year in a row that there's been a year-on-year reduction in the number of suspected suicides. And if we were to consider this as a rate per head of population, we could also note that the rate was statistically significantly lower than the average rate over the last 13 financial years. But to help us put the magnitude of suicide into perspective, let's consider it against a metric we tend to be more familiar with, that of our road toll. Depending on which year we consider, the number of suicides could be anywhere from around 50% more to nearly double that of our road toll. But what part does suicide play in our transport network? Again, that's not an easy question to answer. For my network, that I'll talk about shortly, the number of suicides each year typically varies between 2 to 3 times the number of fatal crashes that we experience. On top of this, we also record up to 10 times this number again of potential suicide attempts. Therefore, I'm sure that you can appreciate that the impacts can be significant. International research would suggest to us that suicide could account for as much as 10% of our road toll. But this does, of course, depend on how road deaths are categorised. When we consider our road toll, which is the cornerstone of how we benchmark our funding allocations to address the road safety issues that we experience, we note that a significant portion of suicide activity on our roads is not classified as part of our road toll. The reason is that when we come to consider someone jumping from, say, an overbridge onto the road below, it's all to do as to whether it was a fall that caused a fatal injury, or if it was caused by being subsequently struck by a vehicle following the fall. So even if a vehicle is involved, if it didn't contribute towards a fatal injury, then it will not be recorded against our road toll, even though it occurred on our roading network. So to avoid any COVID influences, if I was to take the 5-year period from 2014 through to 18 from CAS, which is our crash analysis database, I would find in there that 70 fatalities were listed as suicide in front of a vehicle or suicide within a vehicle. Of those known, 77% were from jumping or lying in front of a moving object. But if we were to take on board international experience that around 10% of a road toll is suicide, then we would have expected this number to be nearly 3 times as high. So I ask you, do you really think that New Zealand is likely to be that different from the rest of the world in this regards? It would put it more in line with the 43 cyclist and 182 pedestrian fatalities that were recorded over this same period. The challenge for myself as a road safety practitioner is that while I can secure funding to improve walking and cycling safety, there's presently no dedicated funding stream to address the impact of suicide. I'll put the numbers to one side for now, as I'm sure that you'd all agree that even the number 1, much like for our Vision Zero for the road toll, is still one too many. So where did my journey start in this? It was actually a very slow start. And it took many years for it to really take effect. But it started with one very simple change. And while many of you may not be in a position to follow a change through over many years, like in the example that I'm going to give, I would still encourage you all to keep your minds open to supporting or leading that small change that could help unlock the door for yourself or for others to make a positive difference in whatever field it is that you work in. For me, that change was to stop reading the newspaper. It was about 1998 when I was part of the SailNet consortium that had the contract for the operation and maintenance of the Auckland Region State Highway Network. My role as a junior engineer at the time was being part of the traffic safety team. My first task each day was to buy the New Zealand Herald and read it to identify where any fatal crashes had occurred the day prior. Having identified the crash site and confirmed that it was on our network, I'd then undertake a site visit so that I could prepare a fatal crash report for the then Transit New Zealand. I would arrive on a cold site. By that, I mean that the crashed vehicles would have been cleared away by the time that I got there. But it might still have some broken glass, some skid marks, or damaged roadside infrastructure for me to view. But then I had to imagine the rest of the scene. Not an ideal situation. The solution that we sold to Transit was the establishment of what we branded as our Fatal Accident Response Team. We weren't so hot on using acronyms back then, otherwise we might have thought more carefully about that title. But what that meant for us, that we would now see the scene firsthand as a result of being on call 24/7. This was fundamental in us building a strong working relationship with police and serious crash units. That helped make us aware of the many other fatal and serious injury type incidents that were occurring on our network as we began to get called out to them as well. It was now that we really began to understand the role and magnitude of suicide, something that previously flew well below the radar for us. Following on from SailNet, MWH took over the maintenance contract for the following 5 years and continued to build on and cement the work for our fatal accident team that had set the groundwork. Over that time, I kept my finger on the pulse via the annual crash reduction studies for the network, which now brings me to my current role that I've held for the last 15 years. This has been that of a traffic safety manager for Waka Kotahi's Auckland Systems Management Alliance contract for largely the same network. Some of you might recognise this under its former guise as the Auckland Motorway Alliance. Again, this contract is responsible for the safe operation and management of Auckland State highway network, as shown on the screen. Due to the nationally strategic nature of the network, the contract was set up under an alliance framework. And it's through this alliancing mindset that we've been able to make the significant gains we've unlocked over the past decade. I'm sure that you can appreciate that due to Auckland's topography that throttles the landmass through the CBD, there's limited resilience in the wider transport network when something goes wrong. Therefore, we have a concerted energy on minimising harm, along with the resultant network disruption that can follow incidents. But it's not been an easy ride with respect to suicide resilience. As I've already noted, there's been no dedicated funding streams available for this element. And anyway, suicide on the road is an Auckland problem, apparently. I'm now going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to ask you to think back to Christmas Day and what you were doing on that day. Hopefully for most of you, it wasn't a work day. Perhaps you're on holiday, spending the day with family, celebrating Christmas, or simply relaxing. Unfortunately for some, the outlook was not quite as positive. And for my colleagues, the message you see before you is what they received and had to respond to on Christmas Day. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate from some of the stats I started off with, this is not just a one-off occurrence. So for those of you involved in transport networks, perhaps this is a good time for me to ask you to ask yourself whether you're aware of what part suicide plays on your network, or whether your teams are equipped to handle it, or whether you've considered what you could do to make your network safer to protect some of our most vulnerable citizens. And for those of you who are designers for the next bit of road infrastructure, have you paused and asked a question around the risks and opportunities to deliver a more resilient design? Before considering the forms of suicide and what we might do to prevent it, I'll ask you to consider some of the impacts. The obvious impact doesn't need spelling out. It's the loss of a human life, the loss of a friend, a work or a sports colleague, a family member. I'm sure that you can all appreciate the grief that this causes. But there are some other impacts that we should also consider. And by breaking it down into small elements, it might help us identify what we can do to make a positive difference. While we might consider that the scene is something for the emergency services to deal with, and that there are the social services for the aftermath, have you considered the part that your maintenance crews play in scene management? Our teams manage traffic around the scene, then depending on the nature of the incident, may be involved with asset restoration and fatal crash scene investigation. There can be quite an emotional toll here. Have you considered that your maintenance teams are out there on the road daily, and hence may be the first to come across a scene, or even someone who's contemplating jumping from a bridge? Do they know how to approach someone who might be threatening suicide? As a road controlling authority, we're focused on keeping traffic moving. But when there's an incident, this can result in many hours of delay to other transport network users. You might say, who cares about some traffic delay? Someone has just lost their life. But can I ask you to consider what that delay may mean for others? Was that a missed critical medical appointment? A missed job interview? Been late for work for a critical worker? Missing an overseas flight for a trip of a lifetime? Or missing seeing your child perform at a sports event or a school play? The consequences can be life-altering for far more than just the immediate victim, their family, and friends. I ask, how might you cope with having someone land on your windscreen or been on the road ahead after they jumped off a bridge and you can't avoid hitting them? What if you were sitting in this driver's seat? I believe that we have some options to minimise some of this harm. But reluctantly, as a road controlling authority, I also need to accept at this time that there's likely nothing we can do in some situations. But perhaps some of you might better help me with some of the answers. For me, this challenge might be on State Highway 20 with a bus stopped at the traffic lights when a passenger asks the driver to let them alight. They then proceed to walk down the footpath to the truck in front and lay down between the wheels as the vehicle moves off. Or it could include a young couple driving down State Highway 22 who have had an argument. With the vehicle stopped, one of them gets out and threatens the other that they'll kill themselves by laying down on the road. And whether intentional or not, gets struck by another passing motorist. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll share some of what we've achieved over the past decade to try and minimise the impact of suicide. This will primarily focus on the risks of jumping from bridges, as at this time, this is where we feel we can be most effective. I'm sure that you can appreciate being a motorway environment with closely spaced interchanges. This presents many opportunities for one to attempt to take their life. As a starting point, we recognise that our maintenance crews may often be first on scene, or they may come across someone contemplating suicide. So while there are many generic employee assistance programs to deal with the trauma and other life issues, we arranged for tailored training to better prepare our crews, especially if there's the opportunity for intervention. This called on expertise from the likes of the police negotiator trainers to help us with our own de-escalation training. We also recognised that we weren't fully aware of the magnitude of the risk profile of each structure on our network. So, with no nationally recognised risk assessment frameworks available to us, we started to look at what we could plagiarise. Our starting point was to take the thrown object risk matrix developed for the then Transit New Zealand back in 2007. This was developed following a fatal rock throwing incident. We modified it to incorporate factors that we thought might highlight suicide risk, such as proximity to hospitals and outpatient services. More recently, we've looked towards some Australian developed risk matrices as well. On top of this, we've reviewed the data held by a traffic operations centre to better understand the actual number of incidents that are occurring. This data, while valuable, has proven challenging to use, as it was not recorded for this purpose. Secondly, with many incidents only being witnessed via CCTV, the true intents can be difficult to determine. But it all helps us paint a picture of the risk. Next came our difficult part. As while we've adopted a Vision Zero philosophy towards road trauma, at this point in time, as suicide is not typically included as part of our road toll in New Zealand, this makes funding change particularly challenging. The primary path we've taken towards minimising risk is through the installation of side screens on our bridges. but at up to $1 million each, they don't come cheap. And on top of this, many of our older structures are extremely challenging to retrofit. And if I was to refer back to this earlier image I shared of Hopetown Bridge, not only are we faced with the structural limitations of some structures, but apparently this handrail in this image is considered an architectural feature, and apparently its form shouldn't be compromised, even at the expense of a human life. We've focused on screens for 4 primary reasons. Firstly, and very importantly, most international studies are in agreement that if you can prevent suicide occurring at an opportune location, you can prevent it from occurring altogether upwards of 80 to 90+% of the time. That is, it's not going to migrate elsewhere. We've just saved a life. Secondly, through our traffic operations data, we've noted that suicide threats may be a magnitude of 10 times as great as the actual attempts. This could mean 1 to 2 road closures every week while each situation is de-escalated. Screening prevents this from occurring and helps eliminate the potential for significant network disruption. Thirdly, with an increase in focus on walking and cycling, we note that many of our older structures don't have ideal handrail heights. And finally, it leverages off the same treatment used to prevent thrown objects. Therefore, with side screens, we have a potential to reduce suicide risk and the associated traffic disruption, improve walking and cycling outcomes, and reduce thrown object risks from our structures. And it's been through bringing together all these elements that we've been able to unlock some funding. Whereas if we'd considered each element in its own merits, we'd struggle to meet any funding threshold. At the same time, we've worked alongside the new capital projects over the past decade to ensure that opportunities to deliver screens as part of new structures hasn't been missed. Unfortunately, as the screens that were erected following the 2006 fatal rock throwing incident were more functional than aesthetic, there's usually been a great reluctance to incorporate screens onto new structures, both from a visual amenity as well as cost perspective. However, I'm directing designers to look at footbridges such as Dilworth and Westgate as early examples of what could be achieved without a negative visual impact. We typically got the response, but those structures don't have screens, which had been our point. That so long as something is designed in at the outset, it can be sympathetic to the structure as a whole. Ideally, I would prefer to see screens installed from day one on all new structures, but politics and funding is not always our friend. So, should a risk evaluation imply that a new structure might not need screens from day one? We've worked to ensure that as a minimum, full, issued for construction designs are delivered as part of any new project. This means that if the situation changes over time, screens can be retrofitted with greater ease and be visually sympathetic to the main structure. Recognising the high cost of bespoke designs to retrofit older structures, we've also developed and delivered a modular design. This modular concept also offers the opportunity to recycle the screens if a bridge is decommissioned. It also allows us to address a bridge that might have a short life expectancy remaining and wouldn't meet any sensible funding thresholds for treatment. An obvious challenge that we've had has been around what low-cost measures we could implement, such as erecting help-finding signage. But when we initially investigated this with the past district health boards, we were met with 2 conflicting opinions. One of yes, let's do it, and the other of no, don't put up signage. And the rationale was that signage might be seen as legitimising a site for suicide attempts. So where to as we move forward? Having investigated further, we do now intend to install some help-finding signage on our bridges. This enables both those contemplating suicide or those who might be witnessing an attempt an opportunity to call for help. There doesn't seem to be any existing research that we can find to suggest that such signage might increase the risks. We would like to do this in such a way that no matter the transport network, be it state highway, local road, or rail, that we have a single, easily identified call point design nationwide. This should make it easier for us to raise awareness of the help one can receive, whether it be for someone in distress or simply a passerby having the opportunity to intervene. We're also looking forwards towards some of the advances in AI and how that could assist us. If farmers can use drones and AI to establish which cattle are pregnant based on how they walk, then surely we can use the same concept to analyse the mannerisms of a pedestrian to determine whether they may be enjoying the view or contemplating other actions. Being human, our Traffic Operations Centre staff can only view so many CCTV cameras at once. And again, AI could be the eyes in the back of their heads. If we can improve our risk analysis, we could preset the cameras to default views when not in use to enhance our ability to pick up those who might be in distress. We already have preset views for our cameras with respect to known traffic incident hotspots. We'd like to establish an interagency network so we can support and leverage off one another's efforts. By working more closely with the various social support services, our understanding of changing risk profiles in the community may also help. And because we don't profess to know all the answers, all the intricacies of suicide, we're also in the process of engaging with medical professionals to help improve our understanding and for us to work out what else we can do. Ultimately, we'd like to see improved funding streams available for physical infrastructure interventions. This seems to be a reoccurring theme with other transport operators as well. At present, I can only dream of having access to the same level of investment that walking and cycling currently enjoys. As I finish, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to listen on this topic today. I will endeavour to answer any questions you may have, but I may need to come back with the specifics, as this journey has been one that's involved several key people, and as such, I don't profess to hold all the knowledge. I also appreciate that with such a topic, there can be lots to digest, and as such, your questions might not be immediate. They may arise in a few days or weeks' time. And if this is the case, please do reach out and we'll endeavour to respond. But before I sign off and you move on, may I ask you once again to please take that moment of time to consider whether you're aware of what role suicide plays in the operation of your transport network or other work activity that you might be involved with. And ask yourself what things you might be able to do to help protect our community from this soul-destroying risk. Together, I believe that we can make a positive difference. And I shall finish at that point there. Sam, I don't know if there's any questions that's...
Is there any questions from the room for a start while I go through here? No. Anyone online? I know it's a very hard topic to think about. I think.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much. Quite a kind of personal question. I just want to ask you, what's it like for you working on suicide risk prevention, and how does that kind of, I guess, feel as a professional so with a road crash? What do you know as a professional?
Just for the audience, so the question was, how does Andrew feel the difference between working as on suicide risk versus working on road crash risk as a road safety professional? Is that right?
It's been an interesting journey. I personally haven't had the experience of anyone that I know commit suicide, so that hasn't been a driver for me. I note, as in dealing in this profession, it's very easy for us to roll off the tip of our tongue 380 deaths in a year. It's just numbers. It's been because of being called out in real time to when those incidents occur, but it's become more real, and it gives you a bit of a different outlook. That one, your understanding of the issues that are out there, and two, that you want to be able to make that positive difference. But it is through taking that step when we became that first network to have our teams on call 24/7, making it real, that changes your mindset, that you're prepared to make a difference. And as I say, this journey has been it started over 20 years ago. Most of us would give up over that length of time. There's been a lot of obstacles. It hasn't been an easy path to follow there, but it's also become very rewarding as we've learned more about this. I was very skeptical when I started off, thinking about, okay, I'm going to put up screens on a bridge and someone's going to walk down the road and jump off the next bridge. I'm not going to make any difference. But as my understanding has increased, I appreciate that there is a huge proportion of the suicide activity that occurs that's very opportunistic. And you only need to buy that person 5 or 10 minutes to get out of that state of mind that they're in, to be able to give them that fresh opportunity to carry on. And so it has then become quite rewarding to know that actually these struggles of seeking that funding, getting changes to the standards, getting screens put on the bridges, and the other work that we've done, it's been making a positive difference. So I found it quite rewarding, and I suspect I've still got another 10 years on this mission as we try and protect our wider network.
Right, thank you. So from Lucy, who might be upstairs or might be at home, I find your comments around research for signage on bridges very interesting. Do you know if there will be a research or monitoring for new or proposed signage that is going up? It strikes me as a good opportunity to help others make the case for future funding if it results in a positive outcome.
It would be our intention to look at trying to do what we can with any research, but it can be a difficult topic to be able to do before and after studies on, just with the nature of how suicide occurs across the network. There is no one particular structure on our network which is more at risk than others that we can go and put in a change and use it as a control and get a very quick result for what's there. So it will be something that we will look at. We haven't been able to find particular research overseas in terms of just for that before and after part. It just seems to be something that doesn't have a negative impact, so it's very low cost. We should do it at the very least. One of the very few items that we've been able to do a before and after study on has been with respect to having screens on a bridge or not. And Grafton Bridge is one of a few bridges internationally whereby it's had screens on it to prevent people from jumping, had those screens removed for it was 6 or 7 years and then had them put back on. And so it showed very clearly in that case that screening makes a positive difference, and we're not going to get that migration of incidents. We will see what we can do with regards to the space of the signing on bridges, but it's not going to be an easy one to get a definitive answer on.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. So the next question might be tricky to answer as well. Are we making progress in our Australian New Zealand funding streams to allocate funding for suicide prevention? I know you mentioned it as an issue. How do you think we're going with progress?
How are we going? At present, most of our success has been around through the capital projects that we've had out there and been able to influence their design and what they have delivered. So in that regards, we've been very successful in what we've delivered. We've only, at this point, failed on a couple of the new structures over the last decade not to get screens up on day one, but they do have designs in the top drawer should they be needed in the future when funding allows. In terms of us going and retrofitting older structures, we are pursuing options there, and I think as the awareness of this issue has been raised, there seems to be more willingness to look at what funding opportunities are available to us, and I hope that over the next couple of years or so that will get easier for us to be able to tap into some of those funds.
Fantastic. Again, I go to the board. So there is a question here. Well, they say they've got a few questions from Anonymous about rail level crossings and suicide. What I might do is actually ask you to contact myself or Andrew directly on that one, because we're actually doing some work wider with TrackSafe and KiwiRail, who are actually bringing together some stuff now. So if you can give me an email, or Andrew an email, if you don't have my email, pop it into the chat and I'll respond. So Amy Williamson, wonderful presentation, Andrew. I agree. As you know, I'm very interested in this issue. We need to better understand its contribution to DSI and how we can consider safety and resilience together. As you know, I've advocated hard for a joined up road safety, public health, road safety approach and Road to Zero. And I think it is a really important facet of that. There was a fascinating presentation at the recent road safety conference in Cairns about the contribution of mental health, depression to substance use. Sorry, I should have read. There was no questions, but you were in Cairns, Andrew. Did you manage to catch the presentation on mental health in DSI?
Yes.
And do you think there's parallels in this work with?
Most definitely, and I think that it's working together amongst our different organisations that is what's going to give us our returns longer term. We're all struggling with similar issues, but we're all working towards the one goal. So bringing together our knowledge bases, our lessons learnt, funding streams, etc., and especially noting that the likes of Waka Kotahi oversees not just the state highways, but significant contributions to funding to the local roads, rail, maritime, etc. That I think that we're on the right path to starting to make a positive change here.
Right. We have gone a little bit longer than I thought, but I thought that was really good because we had some interesting questions. And we had a very interesting topic from Andrew. So everyone, if you can give a hand for Andrew. So if you have any other questions following the presentation, please feel free to reach out. As Andrew said, it is an ongoing journey, and we're very interested to see what Andrew and team continues to work on and how we can all work together to get there. And so I hope you're all now ambassadors for reducing suicide in road transport. Thank you very much, everyone. Ka kite anō.